Hey friends, this is Scott Clem with Preaching in Politics. Hope you're having a good day. We've been talking about the topic of atonement, and over several days, 7 to be exact, we are progressively unfolding what atonement is and its significance to us. Now, in order to have an understanding of why atonement is significant and what it truly means to us, it helps to understand what the problem is, and we want to look at that today. This is part 2 of 7, where we look at the question, is death a punishment or is it a consequence? In order to answer this, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. What do we know? Well, in the beginning, God created the world and, of course, everything in it. And on the 6th day, his last creative act was to create what we might call a hybrid heaven and earth creature, mankind. Man was created from the dirt, from the earth, and yet he has qualities that resemble something otherworldly, resembles God in some way. And in fact, that's exactly what the Bible tells us, that mankind was created to be his image. Now, the word image is the Hebrew word tselem, which means a statue. In other words, get this, unlike all the other creatures, mankind would be God's living statues made in his very likeness. So man was made from the earth, and God brought him to life by his Spirit, breathing into his nostrils the breath of life. Humanity would rule and reign for God in the earth to bring more order and utility and beauty so that more and more life could flourish. We think about what God did in his creation. He spoke things into existence. He ordered things. He made things with utility. He made things beautiful. And to what end? So that more and more life could flourish. And mankind is to image that or mirror God's same qualities into the world. Mankind, therefore, would rule as God's representatives in communion with God, as man cares for God's creation, not according to his own knowledge and wisdom, but according to God's knowledge and wisdom. Of course, we know that after all of that was done, God said everything was very good, only it wasn't going to last. In Genesis 2:27, God commanded that man could eat of every tree of the garden except for one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God warned that in the day that man ate, that he would surely die. Well, you know the story. In rebellion to God, Eve and then Adam seized autonomy for themselves, and they chose to rule and reign according to their knowledge, rather than mirror God's knowledge and wisdom in the world. These living statues were vandalized and defaced, even participating in the mutiny of a rebel spiritual being who desired his own kingdom. Read Isaiah 14:13 and 14. Immediately after eating, they began to assess their situation according to their own newfound knowledge. And they found themselves to be naked and ashamed. They became completely self-centered. And they used God's creation to hide from each other and from God. Now get this. Their knowledge resulted in a loss of intimacy with each other and with God. Of course, with each other, they saw themselves as naked. They hid from each other. There's a loss of intimacy. And then they hid from God, hiding behind the trees. They polluted God's good world by imaging rebellion and distrust instead of God's goodness and love. We might say it this way: they were no longer fit for Eden. So here's the question. Did Adam and Eve die? Well, yes and no. They didn't die in the way that we normally think of death. I mean, after all, Adam lived to a ripe old age of 930 years old. Nevertheless, mankind was exiled out of Eden and away from God's presence into the wilderness. We might say it this way: he was exiled into the realm of death. And God's good world was cursed on account of man's sin. A man has this connection with the world. And instead of bringing good things to the world, man brought a curse. Not only that, but the relationship that Adam and Eve had with the source of all life was now damaged. And their inability to access the tree of life meant that they were under a death sentence. God's decision to put humans back where they started, outside the garden, in the realm of dirt and mortality, you might think of it this way, that it's actually a severe mercy. Why is that? Well, God says, lest he put forth his hand and take. In other words, God didn't want mankind to live in a fallen state forever. And so what God did is both an act that protects humans from themselves while also giving them over to the consequences of their own actions. You'll notice in the narrative that God's judgment isn't accompanied by anger. In fact, the first time we hear of God's anger is into the book of Exodus, when God gets angry with Moses for making excuses 5 times why he couldn't go to Egypt to deliver his people. Here, instead, we see something different. God's judgment comes along with his tender care in providing clothing for these humans. This has caused many people to wonder, is death a punishment or is it a consequence? In preparation to consider what atonement is and what it means for us, I'd like to propose that question, is death punishment or a consequence, that is in fact a false dichotomy. Rather than it being an either-or situation, think of it as a both-and. Death is both a punishment and a consequence. Imagine for a moment a fish, and it jumps out of the water and lands onto a dock, flopping around, and it's, quote-unquote gasping, and it's dying. Our modern culture would look at that and say, that fish is dying not as a punishment, but as a consequence, right? It has exceeded its proper limits. It has entered into an environment where it can only be bound for death. I mean, fish can't breathe in an environment like where we can breathe. Likewise, we can't go into the water and breathe underwater. And this is how the garden narrative portrays death. Man was told that he would die in the day that he ate of the forbidden tree. But when he eats of it, he doesn't die right away. Instead, he's like a fish floundering on the dock, and he dies as a consequence of his sin. But the consequence is the punishment. Most people think of a punishment as a fisherman coming with a huge paddle, and he's gonna bludgeon the fish to death while he's flopping around on the dock. Right? We think of punishment as something that's on top of the consequence. But for the biblical authors, they view the consequence as the punishment. The fish flopping on the dock is the punishment for exceeding its proper limits, for entering into an environment where it can only be bound for death. In the same way, think of the story of Israel's exile into Babylon. Babylon comes and destroys Jerusalem and its temple and takes its people and brings them out of the promised land. This all happened in 568 BC. And the biblical authors like Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel, they view this as divine punishment. However, you might have a political analyst who looks at this and says, well, it was just bad trade policy, or that the invasion was a result of Zedekiah violating his covenant, his agreement with Babylon. He brought it on himself. In other words, a political analyst would look at this invasion of Babylon and say that it was a consequence. The biblical authors look at it not as God whacking a fish with a paddle, but God's own people jumping out of the water onto the dock and suffering the punishment of their sins, which is the consequence of death. God's wrath is not inseparable from him handing people over to the consequences of their own decisions. Read Romans 1:18 through 32. So what does this have to do with atonement? Well, you'll have to stay tuned to part 3. If you like this video, like and share, leave a comment, and stay tuned for tomorrow. Take care.